So in terms of what we're sort of going to look at, I just wanted to highlight first of all that the size of local authorities and the nature of the information that they process means that they're one of the highest reporters of data breaches to the Information Commissioner's Office. And yeah, for those reasons, I don't really think that is a massive surprise. The health sector is the highest reporter, and obviously that's because they have policy in place that requires them to report certain breaches to the ICO, and also I think just down to the nature of the information that they process. And in terms of mentioning that, I don't think it's all kind of negative. I think it's quite a positive thing that obviously local authorities are aware of their obligations, they're aware when a data breach has taken place, and they're taking proactive steps to, report that to the ICO and do something about it. So yeah, I think that's quite a positive step to take. So at the moment, breaches aren't mandatory, but as of the breaches aren't mandatory, reporting breaches isn't mandatory, is perhaps a better way of putting it. But from the 25th of May, they will become mandatory for certain types of breaches, and we'll go into that in a second. We do, however, recommend it good practice at the moment, and like I say, we do get some coming through. So one thing to be aware of in some of the work that we've been looking at in terms of preparing for how we're going to deal with these data breaches is the time lapse between becoming aware of the breach and reporting it to the ICO. We're finding that there's still quite a significant gap there. And obviously that gap's going to need to be closed as we move closer to the 25th of May. And again, I'll explain why that is in a second. So what we're going to cover today, very, very briefly, is what is a data breach, investigating and notifying, and that's where the little exercise comes in. Good practice, so there's things that you need to be looking at in terms of getting it right, and also guidance, so where you can go for further information. So first of all, what is a personal data breach? So essentially it's a security incident, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all security incidents will be a personal data breach. And for GDPR purposes, it's obviously identifying whether there's been a breach of that personal data. So when a security incident takes place, the data controller is going to need to quickly establish whether that's happened. So what is a personal data breach? Well, it's more than just losing personal data. I think we often get a lot of misconceptions that it's literally just about losing personal data, but the GDPR defines it as the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorised disclosure of, or access to personal data. So that's obviously quite wide in terms of what a personal data breach can capture. And previous opinion from the Article 29 Working Party categorises breaches according to three well-known information security principles. So first of all, confidentiality, availability, and integrity. And I think this just helps to break down that definition a little bit more, to kind of think about it in those kind of three categories. So obviously you've got your unauthorised or accidental disclosure of, you've got your loss of access to or the destruction, or in terms of integrity, you've got that kind of alteration, unauthorised or accidental alteration of that data. So it may be that a data breach falls within one of these categories, or it may be that it falls within all three of them, depending on what the nature of the breach is. And as I've already mentioned, at the moment there's no requirement to report these personal data breaches, but like I say, as of 25th of May, that's going to change. So GDPR introduces an obligation on organisations to report all data breaches where it's going to result, likely to result in a risk to people's rights and freedoms. So where there's that risk, you need to report it to the ICO. Where it's likely to result in a high risk, then you also need to report it to the individual as well. So there's sort of two obligations there to think about. In terms of that gap that I was on about before, this is where it becomes important. So for both of those, whether you're reporting it to the ICO or the individual, it has to be without undue delay. And in terms of reporting it to the ICO, it has to be within 72 hours of becoming aware of it. So obviously 72 hours isn't a very long time, and that's what I was meaning before, when that gap in terms of becoming aware of it and reporting it needs to obviously reduce to comply with GDPR. The Article 29 Working Party Guidance does include more information on what it means to become aware of a breach as well. So that's worth taking a look at, because I've not really included that within this workshop. So once a data controller becomes aware of a personal data breach, given the fact that the whole basis of reporting is around that element of risk, there's going to need to be some immediate risk assessment, and that's going to be crucial to establish both the likelihood and the severity of the risk involved. So if it's likely that there'll be a risk, report to the ICO. If it's unlikely to result in a risk, then you don't need to report it to the ICO. I think there's been some debate from a number of different sectors saying ultimately there's always going to be some element of risk in a data protection breach. And yes, I think we would appreciate that. And as we go on in a minute, I think it's about looking at certain factors to try and work out where that risk might sit. And I think I mentioned this morning that Article 29 guidance contains a link to a methodology. So it's the European Union for Network and Information Security recommendations. And essentially it's a methodology for assessing the severity of a breach. So that can be found on page 22 of the Working Party Guidance. There's a direct link to that there. And I think it's something that organisations might want to consider incorporating into their breach management plan and might find that beneficial. So in terms of risk assessment criteria, the Article 29 Working Party Guidance is quite detailed on this. And I personally think it's quite helpful in terms of there's a whole section that breaks it down in terms of these criteria and what you need to be thinking of when looking at the risk. And I think, to be honest, they're quite self-explanatory, but I think it's also to sort of, sometimes you need to sort of think outside the box a little bit in terms of, so I guess type of breach, the ease of identification of individuals, say. So in terms of, if that is an email that gets sent round and it's simply just a name and address, then you're kind of lowering the risk a bit further down the scale. If that is, say, really highly sensitive information, so it identifies, for example, a foster parent to a birth parent. That's just one person's piece of personal information, but the ease of identification and the severity of the consequence of that shoot that kind of a lot higher up that scale. So yeah, it's kind of sort of going through these and looking at, I guess, how they sort of tip those scales of risk. Just to highlight that GDPR also details what information you must provide when reporting a breach to the ICO. What if you don't have all the information that's required? Well, the GDPR does recognise that, 72 hours, it's not always going to be possible to fully investigate a breach and know everything and all the ins and outs about it within that time frame. So it allows you to provide the information in phases if needed, but what I would advise is that you still report the breach as soon as you can after becoming aware of it and not later than 72 hours, so then you're still meeting your obligation there. Explain any delay when you're reporting that breach. As I said earlier, we are an understanding and pragmatic regulator. Tell us when you expect to be able to provide that further information, and then prioritise any required investigation and just provide the further information ASAP and just without any further undue delay. So how can you actually notify a breach to the ICO? So this was kind of discussed briefly this morning. So the website form that we've always had, in terms of that you go through our website and you fill in quite a detailed form and go through all of that, that's still there. If that's your preferred method, then, you know, by all means use that. But as I mentioned this morning, we have set up a telephone helpline that you can call and report the breaches through that. And like I said, it's just a really good opportunity, I think, and I think we're quite positive that hopefully it'll sort of react a bit more to what data controllers want, in being able to have a conversation with a person, and especially because it's something that's new, people are going to be uncertain about what breaches to report, what not to report, and I think there's always going to be more risk-adverse organisations than others. And yeah, they can then immediately offer advice about what information you might need to provide, or what kind of things you might need to go off and look at doing. So, like I said, that's available now. That helpline's live, and you can ring that. So if you wanted a bit of a practice running the lead up to GDPR, I'm not saying go out and purposefully start breaching, but should that situation arise, then yeah, by all means ring the helpline rather than using the website form, and use that as your own kind of sort of pilot run through. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to benefit from it as well as us. So
is that open 24/7?
No, I don't think it is. Not that I've been made aware of anyway. No, we did have a question around that at the last one about, you know, what is the expectation of this going to be in terms of, you know, say a breach occurs on, I don't know, what, a Thursday, your 72-hour deadline is going to be up on a Sunday. So, yeah, whilst you might come into the office to kind of investigate that, or, you know, you might want to look into it further, where does the line draw at a weekend? And I still don't think we have all the answers around that at the moment. I think people are getting scared that they're going to have a mobile phone as a DPO and be on call. But I really don't know how that is sort of going to pan out at the moment. I like to think that an unreasonable approach won't be taken to it, but we'll see how it gets interpreted.
Like over the Easter weekend or Christmas weekend?
Yeah, again, that was something else that was discussed. So I do think there's still quite a few things that need to be thought out around this, and hopefully there'll be more clarification on it soon.
In terms of awareness, there are times that incidents can only come to our attention sometime after they've happened.
Yep.
So somebody within the authority has become aware of the incident, but it's taken us to be able to identify that it's a data breach and needs reporting.
Yeah.
So would we, in those situations, if we said we've just found out that 3 weeks ago X happened, would that be considered to be late reporting?
Yes, technically that would be a breach. As soon as somebody in that organisation becomes aware of it, that's when the clock starts ticking. And that's when I'll cover it in a second around the good practice points. Staff training and awareness is going to be crucial to try and close that gap. So just quickly then, in terms of other things to be aware of, so data processors are also required to report breaches to you as the data controller as soon as they become aware of it. And this is something that you'll really want to reiterate to your data processors, because again, if they become aware of it, technically they're working on your behalf, that's the data controller becoming aware of it, and you'll want a smooth communication chain there so they can get that across to you and you know whether that needs reporting to the ICO or not. Keep a record of all data breaches, so regardless of whether they're reportable to the ICO, there's actually a requirement under Article 33.5 that you still document the facts relating to a breach, its effects and any remedial action that's been taken. And I think that's part of your overall obligation with the accountability principle as well, and it's just really useful, I think, as a learning experience, documenting them breaches and obviously being able to learn from mistakes. And even though I don't like to go on about the fines, a failure to notify within time frame could result in a fine. It technically is a breach. So moving on then to good practice. So what are the key points to sort of keep in mind in terms of trying to get it right? So first of all, key I think is preparation. Be prepared, know how to recognise personal data breach, allocate responsibility for managing breaches to a dedicated person or team. And then I think the most important thing there that goes back to that question, train staff to know how to recognise them and who they should contact. If you've got that kind of in place, that's going to make that a much more sort of smooth process and allow you to sort of comply with that 72 time frame. And also prepare a response plan for addressing any personal data breaches that occur. And then secondly, respond. So making sure that you've got a process in place to assess the likely risks, so that risk assessment process, a process to notify the ICO within 72 hours, also same to inform affected individuals, document all breaches within that requirement, and then, like I said, evaluate the causes of the breach and learn from the mistakes where possible. And then in terms of guidance, we've actually just published some guidance on our within our guide to the GDPR around personal data breaches. So pretty much all of what I have just covered there is within that guidance, and also the Article 29 Working Party goes into quite a bit of detail. And there's some quite useful examples around what breaches you should and shouldn't report in there. What are people's thoughts and sort of comments around that? So in terms of the first one, where the controllers created and stored a backup, and the USB has been stolen, but the encryption key's not been compromised. So do we think that we should notify the ICO about that one? Okay, I think that's reasonable. And what about communicate to the data subject? No.
I'm a bit of a beginner here, but when you're assessing the likelihood of being able to re-identify something that's maybe encrypted, is that done from a point of view of assuming that they're a data expert, or you have to assume that the person who might re-identify them?
Yeah, so in our anonymisation code of practice, we kind of cover that issue around re-identification, and in there's something called the motivated intruder test. So someone who's got that kind of real sort of need or want to re-identify that data, could they do that? And it's always worth taking that into consideration, even though, you know, most average Joe probably wouldn't be able to. So yeah, you are looking at those kind of high levels of encryption to protect that data. So what about the next one then? A HIV clinic sends its monthly newsletter to its patients and puts the email addresses in the CC field by mistake instead of the BCC field. So what do we think about notifying the ICO?
Yes.
Yeah. And again, if that was just a list of people who are a member of some gardening subscription, and that email went round, then that's what I was saying before, when that would probably really lower that risk level. But then because it's a HIV clinic and the kind of the nature of that information and things that you can infer from that information shoots that straight up that level of risk.
Stacey, if it was a gardening club,
yeah,
would you not inform the ICO?
That's when then you'd start to look at, say, the number of affected individuals. So if it's, say, like, I don't know, maybe a couple of hundred as an example, then perhaps not. And if it's not ticking any of those other boxes, but, you know, if you're shooting up into the hundreds of thousands, then that might kind of balance that risk a bit higher. So what do we think about communicating that onto the data subjects?
Yes.
Yeah, but they'd already know anyway.
Well, yeah, exactly, that's true. But again, good practice from the organisation's point of view as well, to kind of hold your hands up and, you know, say we shouldn't have done that, and, you know, acknowledge that. So medical records in a hospital are unavailable for over 24 hours due to a cyber attack. What do we think about this one? Report it to the ICO?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think for this one, it's the risk to patient well-being and the fact that those records might not be accessible for that amount of time. You know, there's medical professionals that might not have access to information that they really need for that patient care. And also, I think the number of potentially affected individuals. And I guess that the basis of that one is probably the recent WannaCry example really is the most kind of related incident to that. And what do we think about communicating to data subjects? So the next one then, what was that, sorry? Yes, for contacting the data subjects about it, yeah, because of the high risk. So in terms of this next one then, and this is the data controller contracting the third party, and it identifies an issue in the code, and the effect of the flaw means that any user can access the account details of any other user. So notify the ICO, what did we think?
Yes.
Yeah? This one is a bit more of a difficult one to tell really, and it falls within the kind of, it depends. You might not be able to make a kind of affirmative decision based on that information that you've got there. So whilst you're thinking that it might be falling within that kind of risk category, you're probably going to want to get a bit more information there to kind of see if you can answer a few more of these kind of questions. And I guess the same applies for communicating it to the data subject, because it depends really on the kind of nature and sensitivity of the data involved and what the account is that's been breached.
So it's also things like it's going to hit the press. So we had something like this happen to us, not different to this, but we actually contacted 7,000 people because we knew our local paper was going to go wild with it, and then they were going to contact us and create those problems. So it's better to go, this is what's happened, you're not at risk, this is why, but you will see it, and it's out there done. Yeah, and I think a good point to bear in mind with this one as well is getting some information off the data processor as to the likely risk of that information being compromised. Has it actually been compromised or not? And your data processor might be able to tell you that kind of information. If they're certain that that information hasn't been compromised, then that's going to drop that level of risk. So it's just about thinking about different things like that really, and just keeping in mind these kind of bullet points. So what did we think about the last one? Yeah, so this is the classic depends. Just reading that, you're not going to know at all what's involved, the nature of the information, how severe that's going to be. So that's a typical example, I think, of where you're going to need to do a bit more of an investigation. And to be honest, that might not even fall within the category, you know, where to contact the ICO at that point, because we wouldn't really be able to give you much information until you had a bit further information. So you definitely want to try and make some immediate further inquiries on that one.